People always assume the fireworks start with the headline topic. They think somebody walks onto the set, says one outrageous thing, and suddenly everybody is yelling across the table like it's Thanksgiving dinner with unlimited wine. That's television. Real life is a little sneakier. Sometimes you don't realize what the argument is really about until 20 minutes into the conversation. What starts as one question quietly morphs into another, then another, until suddenly you're not arguing about a mayoral candidate anymore. You're arguing about socialism, then feminism, then media, then presidential campaigns. Then podcasts somehow become more influential than newspapers that once thought they ruled America forever. Welcome to modern politics. That's why I love doing this show. Not because everyone agrees. God, that would be boring. I like watching people reveal how they think. That's where the interesting part lives. People usually arrive convinced they're bringing facts. What they're really bringing is a worldview. And once those worldviews collide, that's when television becomes worth watching. This particular discussion started with what sounded like a simple political question. Did Barack Obama normalize the politics of New York mayoral candidate Zohran Mamdani by calling him? Simple enough, except it wasn't simple at all, because nothing involving Barack Obama is ever just about Barack Obama. Obama has always fascinated me, not because he yells. He doesn't, not because he dominates every room. He rarely needs to. His style has always been subtler than that. He's the kind of political figure who often seems to influence events without making himself the center of attention. That's a different kind of power. I looked around the panel and threw the question out there, did this phone call mean something? Nobody knows exactly what Obama said. None of us were on the call. But politics isn't just about transcripts. It's about signals. Sometimes what matters isn't the conversation itself. It's the fact that the conversation happened. I mentioned something I've noticed over the years. Obama has a habit of putting his thumb on the scale, not necessarily out in public, behind the scenes, quickly, strategically. It's something he's done before. I remembered the conversation surrounding Ruth Bader Ginsburg. There had been reports that Obama encouraged her to retire. That obviously didn't happen. The audience laughed because history has a funny way of making political what-ifs sound almost unbelievable in hindsight. Then there was 2016, another fascinating moment. Joe Biden was considering whether it might finally be his turn. Instead, Hillary Clinton became the Democratic nominee. Politics is full of moments where nobody officially pushes anyone. Yet somehow everyone knows someone nudged somebody. That's Washington. Nothing is ever accidental. So when Obama's name comes up again in connection with another rising Democratic figure, naturally people start reading between the lines. That's what political observers do. We connect dots, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. But connecting dots is practically America's favorite pastime. The discussion turned toward Mamdani himself. He's become one of those political figures people either embrace enthusiastically or reject immediately. There's very little middle ground. I pointed out something that many people have noticed. He's associated with socialist politics. Some critics go even further because of statements they've highlighted, including comments about capitalism. Whether voters agree or disagree with those positions is another discussion entirely, but the labels aren't going away, and labels matter, especially in American politics. Because once somebody becomes the symbolic face of an idea, every other politician wearing the same party label suddenly gets asked about that person. That's how elections work. One candidate says something controversial. Then suddenly, candidates thousands of miles away are standing in front of microphones explaining whether they agree. You can almost hear campaign managers groaning every time it happens. So I wondered aloud whether Obama was looking ahead. Maybe he saw what was coming. Maybe he recognized that if this candidate became nationally associated with Democrats, every Democrat in America would eventually have to answer questions about him. That's politics. It's rarely just about one city. One of the panelists added some local perspective. Living in New York, she explained, means hearing about this race constantly. According to her, Mamdani had been meeting with real estate leaders and business figures throughout the city. That caught my attention because campaigns often sound very different in conference rooms than they do at rallies. Public speeches are one thing. Private meetings are another. She suggested that regardless of ideology, the real challenge of governing New York isn't simply having bold ideas, it's managing an enormous city. That's a fair point. New York isn't just a symbol. It's an incredibly complicated machine. Millions of people, massive budgets, transportation, housing, polis, schools, sanitation. It's easy to promise change. Running the machinery afterward? That's another story. Ideology gets headlines. Mad Magem gets garbage picked up. Mad Magem keeps subways running. Mad Magem determines whether people feel safe walking home. That's less glamorous, but it's reality. I asked another question that made the audience laugh. What does Mamdani do for a living? It wasn't meant as an insult. It was curiosity wrapped inside humor. The panel laughed. Someone answered that he had served as a city councilman. Fair enough, politics often follows predictable career paths. City council, mayor, governor, Congress. Everybody climbs the ladder. Nothing unusual there. Then the conversation drifted toward another issue making headlines: housing. Specifically, rent-controlled and rent-stabilized apartments. Andrew Cuomo had criticized Mamdani over his housing situation. Politics has an amazing ability to turn almost anything into campaign ammunition. Where you live, what you drive, where your parents worked, who paid for college, everything becomes evidence, sometimes meaningful, sometimes ridiculous. One panelist pushed back. She argued that criticizing someone's apartment wasn't especially persuasive. Parents having money, she said, didn't automatically define the candidate. If someone is 33 years old, eventually responsibility belongs to that adult, not their parents. Agan, a reasonable point. Politics often loves guilt by association. Reality is usually more complicated. The conversation briefly shifted toward Cuomo himself. Someone noted that he'd only recently moved back into New York City. Another pointed out he'd served as governor and therefore knew the state extremely well. Then Eric Adams entered the discussion. Apparently, he'd been living somewhere unexpected. The audience laughed again. Politics sometimes feels less like governing and more like comparing bizarre housing arrangements. Everyone has an address. Everyone else's address becomes campaign material. At some point, you almost expect candidates to debate utility bills. That's modern politics. And then, almost without warning, the conversation pivoted. One topic ended, another arrived. If politics teaches you anything, it's that no discussion stays in one lane for very long. Someone brought up Costco. Yes, Costco. Because apparently America has reached the stage where warehouse stores and abortion medication can occupy the same sentence. I couldn't resist when I heard that Costco was reportedly stopping sales of mifepristone because of a lack of demand. One thought immediately popped into my head. Costco sells things in bulk. That's their entire business model. So naturally, I asked the obvious joke, who exactly is buying abortion pills in bulk? The audience exploded. Sometimes comedy isn't about taking sides. Sometimes it's simply recognizing the absurd image your brain immediately creates. A shopping cart, industrial-sized mayonnaise, 48 rolls of paper towels, a 50-pound bag of dog food, and then abortion medication. Comedy writes itself. I doubled down with another joke, asking just how active someone's dating life would have to be before buying abortion pills at Costco seemed like an efficient shopping strategy. The audience laughed even harder. Humor has a way of cutting through tension, especially during discussions that otherwise become impossibly serious. Not everyone at the table stayed in comedy mode, though. One panelist immediately shifted the conversation toward medical context. She explained that mifepristone isn't used exclusively for abortions. According to her, it also has other medical applications involving women's health. She mentioned that it forms part of a two-drug treatment and argued that discussions surrounding it often become broader conversations about healthcare in general. Fair enough. That's an important distinction to raise. Whenever a medical issue enters political debate, then she broadened the argument further. Birth control, hormones, medical treatments, insurance coverage. She argued that many women take hormonal medications for reasons unrelated to preventing pregnancy. Sometimes they're prescribed to address other health concerns. That, she suggested, was part of the larger conversation. I listened, then waited, because television debates have rhythms. One person expands the issue, another narrows it. Someone cracks a joke. Someone gets offended. Someone appeals to science. Someone appeals to common sense. And eventually everybody realizes they're talking about much more than whatever appeared on the cue card at the beginning of the segment. The discussion was heading there now, and we were only getting started. That's the funny thing about political conversations. You think you're debating one issue, and before long you're debating the entire culture. We had started with New York politics, then housing, then abortion medication. Now the discussion was becoming something even bigger, how Americans decide what they believe in the first place. One of the panelists explained that medications like mifepristone shouldn't be viewed through a single lens. She emphasized that some drugs commonly associated with one purpose are also prescribed for other medical reasons. She also argued that many women take hormonal birth control for reasons unrelated to preventing pregnancy, including managing other health concerns. That's a perspective plenty of people hold. Whether everyone agrees with it is another question. And that's really the point of a panel discussion. If everybody arrived with identical opinions, I'd save the production budget and just interview myself. Still, I couldn't help noticing something that's become increasingly common in modern political debates. People rarely stay within the boundaries of the original question. A discussion about one medication becomes a debate about healthcare. Healthcare becomes a debate about feminism. Feminism becomes a debate about political messaging. And somehow, before you know it, everyone's arguing about presidential elections. It's almost impressive. The audience laughed as I tossed in one last joke. Just don't take it in the Costco bathroom. Sometimes a joke is just a joke. Sometimes it serves another purpose. Comedy lowers people's defenses. Once people laugh, they're usually willing to keep listening. That's something politics could learn from comedians. Unfortunately, politicians usually try to become comedians. That's a terrible career move. Leave the jokes to professionals. The conversation continued moving. Now we were discussing elections. Specifically, one question that had puzzled a lot of political observers: why didn't abortion become the decisive issue many expected? For months leading into the election, analysts predicted it would dominate everything. There were endless articles, countless television panels, hours upon hours of commentary insisting this would be the defining issue. And then Election Day happened. Reality rarely consults television producers before making its entrance. So I asked the obvious question: why didn't it play out the way so many expected? One panelist added another surprise. It wasn't just abortion. The broader argument about protecting democracy also failed to resonate as strongly with voters as many strategists believed it would. That observation opened an entirely different discussion. Political campaigns often convince themselves that voters care most about the issues campaign headquarters talks about. Those aren't always the same things. Campaign consultants spend months perfecting messages. Then voters walk into polling places thinking about grocery bills, or housing, or public safety, or something nobody on cable news discussed all week. Politics has a habit of humbling experts, again and again. One explanation immediately stood out. The media landscape had changed dramatically. That wasn't really controversial. Anyone paying attention could see it. Back in 2016, traditional news organizations still occupied a much larger place in American life. People consumed information differently. Television news mattered more. Large newspapers carried greater influence. Legacy media still had the ability to shape national conversations in ways that feel almost nostalgic today. Fast forward several years, the ground had shifted, not gradually, completely. People weren't waiting for tomorrow morning's newspaper. They weren't even necessarily watching evening news broadcasts. They were getting information from podcasts, live streams, YouTube channels, independent creators, social media clips, long-form interviews. Algorithms had become editors. Phones had become television studios. Everybody suddenly had a microphone. That changes everything. One example made the point better than any statistic could. Joe Rogan, whether people love him or hate him, nobody seriously argues that he lacks an audience. That's just reality. The numbers speak for themselves. When Donald Trump appeared on Rogan's podcast, millions upon millions of people watched or listened. The audience estimate mentioned during the discussion reached astonishing levels, tens of millions. The exact figure wasn't even the important part. The important part was the scale. That kind of audience would have sounded impossible for a podcast not very long ago today. It's simply the world we live in, compete that with giving an interview to a traditional newspaper, even an iconic publication. The reach just isn't the same anymore. That isn't necessarily a criticism of newspapers. It's an observation about how people consume information now. Attention has migrated. People choose conversations over press releases. They choose authenticity, or at least what feels authentic, over polished messaging. That shift has enormous political consequences because campaigns built for yesterday's media environment often struggle inside today's. I couldn't help making the obvious observation. Maybe candidates should go where the audience actually is. It's not exactly revolutionary. If millions of potential voters are listening somewhere, maybe that's where you should be speaking. Instead, too many campaigns still behave as though it's 2008. The audience isn't there anymore. They're somewhere else. Politics sometimes resembles a company insisting everyone still shops at the mall while customers have already moved online. You don't win by pretending change never happened. You adapt or you lose. Discussion became increasingly interesting because it wasn't really about one podcast. It was about accessibility. Could politicians succeed while avoiding unscripted conversations, or had that become impossible? There's something uniquely revealing about a long-form interview, not 5 minutes, not 8 carefully rehearsed talking points. 3 hours. Nobody stays perfectly polished for 3 hours. Eventually, people relax. They stop reciting memorized lines. They answer questions naturally. That's either a politician's greatest opportunity or worst nightmare. Probably both. Some politicians embrace that challenge. Others avoid it. Voters notice. Maybe more than campaigns realized, the conversation naturally turned toward Vice President Kamala Harris. The discussion referenced reports that she and Joe Rogan had not reached an agreement for an interview. According to the account being discussed, there were disagreements over logistics and the format, including where the interview would take place. Whether every detail mattered wasn't really the point. The larger point was perception. Long-form podcasts have developed a reputation for unpredictability. They're difficult to control. Questions wander. Topics evolve. Conversations take unexpected turns. That's exactly why audiences enjoy them. They're not watching because everything is predictable. They're watching because it isn't. Traditional political interviews often follow familiar patterns. Question, prepared answer, pivot, talking point, commercial break. Everybody goes home. Long-form podcasts are different. Sometimes the host interrupts. Sometimes the guest changes direction. Sometimes both people spend 15 minutes discussing something nobody expected. That's real conversation. And audiences can usually tell the difference. I think that's one reason podcasts have exploded in popularity. People are hungry for authenticity, or at least what feels like authenticity. Whether every guest is completely genuine is impossible to know, but the format creates an opportunity for viewers to judge for themselves. That's powerful, much more powerful than many political professionals appreciate. The discussion expanded beyond one candidate. The broader argument became impossible to ignore. If politicians only appear in carefully controlled environments, eventually voters start wondering what they're afraid of. It's human nature. Confidence looks different when someone willingly enters unfamiliar territory. People notice that whether they're Republicans, Democrats, independents, or people who barely follow politics at all, authenticity has become political currency. Not because politicians suddenly became more authentic, because audiences became better at detecting rehearsed performances. The internet did that. Millions of people spend hours watching ordinary conversations online. They've developed instincts. They know what heavily scripted communication sounds like. They also know when someone seems comfortable enough to think out loud. Those aren't the same thing. The panel agreed on at least one point. Candidates have to meet voters where voters actually are, not where campaign strategists wish they were. That means podcasts, online creators, digital platforms. Places many political professionals once dismissed. Ignoring those audiences has become increasingly difficult and maybe impossible. One panelist summed it up simply: if you're not willing to go everywhere, then eventually you're nowhere. Now, that's a striking way to put it. Political communication has become decentralized. There is no longer one gatekeeper. There isn't one television network everyone watches, one newspaper everyone reads, one radio program everyone hears. America fractured into thousands of conversations. Candidates now have to participate in far more of them. That's exhausting, but that's democracy in the digital age. You don't get to choose where people are paying attention. You either show up or someone else will. The audience applauded, not necessarily because everyone agreed, because they recognized something true. The rules had changed. Some campaigns adapted, others didn't. And whether anyone liked that reality hardly mattered. Reality usually wins those arguments. As I looked around the table, it struck me that our conversation had traveled an incredible distance. We'd started with Barack Obama, then New York politics, then socialism, housing, women's health care, election strategy, podcasts, media, public trust, all in one discussion. That's politics now. Everything connects to everything else. Every issue eventually becomes another issue. Every debate becomes a bigger debate, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, comedians end up moderating conversations that used to belong exclusively to journalists and politicians. Maybe that's strange. Maybe it's exactly what America needs. Either way, the conversation wasn't over yet. By the time the discussion was winding down, one thing had become impossible to ignore. The conversation had started with a question about one political phone call. It had turned into a discussion about the future of American politics. That's what happens when you stop looking only at headlines and start paying attention to the bigger picture. Every issue is connected. Every campaign decision eventually reflects a larger philosophy. Every media appearance sends a message. Even choosing not to appear somewhere sends one. That's something politicians still struggle to understand. For decades, campaigns operated under a relatively simple formula: book appearances on major television networks, give interviews to respected newspapers, deliver carefully prepared speeches, hope those messages filtered down to voters. That strategy worked for a long time. The problem is that the world changed. The internet didn't just create more media, it completely rearranged who controls attention. Attention used to flow through a handful of institutions. Now it flows almost everywhere. Sometimes it lands on a network news broadcast. Sometimes it lands on a podcast recorded in someone's studio. Sometimes it lands on a live stream watched by millions of people around the world. The point isn't which platform is better. The point is that audiences, not institutions, now decide what matters. That's a massive shift, and it explains why campaigns that rely exclusively on traditional media often struggle to connect with modern voters. People want conversations, not speeches. They want to watch someone think, not simply recite talking points. That doesn't mean every podcast interview is profound. Far from it. Some wander all over the place. Some become hilarious. Some become awkward. Some become unforgettable. But they're rarely boring, and voters notice. One point raised during our discussion kept coming back to me: if millions of people are gathering somewhere, why wouldn't a politician want to be there? It sounds almost too obvious, yet campaigns often overcomplicate simple ideas. Instead of asking where voters are spending their time, they ask where political consultants feel comfortable. Those aren't always the same place. Comfort has never won many elections. Contentions does. That's the challenge modern candidates face. You don't just have to communicate, you have to communicate across dozens of completely different audiences. One interview won't reach everyone. One television appearance won't dominate the news cycle for a week anymore. Those days are gone. Today's voters build their own information streams. Some listen to podcasts during long drives. Some scroll through social media clips during lunch breaks. Some still read newspapers every morning. Some watch cable news every night. Many do all of the above. Campaigns have to understand that reality. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. One of the strongest observations from our discussion was that candidates can't afford to isolate themselves inside carefully managed environments forever. People eventually notice. Voters have become remarkably good at sensing when someone feels overly rehearsed. That's probably because people now consume so much unscripted content. They spend hours listening to ordinary conversations. That changes expectations. When someone answers every question with a polished 30-second response, it feels different. Whether that's fair or unfair doesn't really matter. Perception influences politics, always has, always will. That doesn't mean every long-form interview is automatically honest. Of course not. People can still perform. They can still prepare. They can still avoid difficult subjects. But longer conversations create more opportunities for genuine moments. Those moments matter. Sometimes they're funny. Sometimes they're uncomfortable. Sometimes they're revealing. Often they're all three. Looking back at our discussion, I also found it interesting how many different political assumptions surfaced throughout the evening. Take the earlier conversation about New York politics. The debate wasn't simply about one mayoral candidate. It reflected a larger national argument over ideology versus governing. Campaigns often focus on bold promises. Governments eventually have to focus on practical management. Those aren't always the same skill set. Running a city isn't just delivering speeches. It's budgets, transportation, public safety, housing, personal retraca, thousands of daily decisions that rarely become headlines. The audience understands that. Maybe more than politicians sometimes realize. Then there was the discussion about healthcare and medication. That exchange illustrated something else about modern political conversations. Almost every issue has layers. People often approach the same subject from completely different directions. One person focuses on public policy, another focuses on personal experience, someone else focuses on medical context, another person responds with humor. None of those approaches automatically erase the others. They simply reflect different priority. That's why these conversations become so spirited. People aren't always arguing about facts. They're arguing about which facts deserve the most attention. That's a very different thing. Comedy has always played a unique role in those discussions. Some people misunderstand what comedians actually do. Our job isn't to solve political problems. Our job is to notice contradictions, to point out absurdities, to ask questions everyone else tiptoes around. Sometimes those questions make people laugh. Sometimes they make people uncomfortable. Usually both. That's healthy. Democracy benefits from uncomfortable questions. It also benefits from the ability to laugh at itself once in a while. Politics becomes so serious that nobody can joke anymore. We've probably lost something important. Humor doesn't weaken democracy. It often reminds us that no political movement is perfect. No politician is perfect. No ideology is immune from criticism. Everyone eventually becomes the punchline. That's equality. As the discussion moved toward its conclusion, another reality became increasingly clear. Political campaigns no longer control the conversation the way they once did. They can try. They can schedule press conferences, the relish carefully worded statements, coordinate interviews. But the public conversation has become too decentralized. Millions of people now participate. Millions comment. Millions react. Sometimes a podcast creates the biggest political story of the week. Sometimes a short online clip reaches more people than an entire cable news program. Whether anyone likes that evolution isn't really the issue. It's already happened. The only question left is whether political leaders understand it. Some clearly do, others appear to be catching up. The panel's broader point stayed with me. Candidates need to go where the people are. That doesn't mean abandoning traditional journalism. It means recognizing that traditional journalism no longer exists in isolation. It's now one voice among many, a very important voice. But one voice nonetheless. The audience applauded near the end of the discussion. Not because every disagreement had been resolved. They hadn't. Good conversations rarely end with complete agreement. They end with better questions. That's what happened here. Questions about political messaging, questions about media, questions about public trust, questions about authenticity, questions about how campaigns adapt to a world that changes faster every election cycle. Those are worthwhile conversations. Whether viewers agreed with every opinion expressed around the table wasn't the point. The point was that the discussion happened. People heard competing perspectives. They watched arguments unfold in real time. They made up their own minds. That's exactly what panel discussions are supposed to encourage. As I thought back over everything we'd covered, one conclusion seemed unavoidable. Politics today isn't just about policy. It's about communication. The best ideas in the world don't matter much if nobody hears them. Likewise, the loudest message in the world doesn't automatically become the best one. Candidates have to earn attention. Then they have to keep it. And that's becoming harder every year. The media landscape will continue changing. New platforms will emerge. Others will fade. Audiences will keep moving. Politicians who adapt to those changes will have opportunities previous generations never imagined. Those who refuse to adapt may find themselves speaking to smaller and smaller audiences while wondering what happened. History usually answers that question with one word: change. Whether discussing a New York mayoral race, healthcare policy, presidential campaigns, or the growing influence of podcasts, the evening ultimately pointed toward the same lesson. The rules are different now, not because someone officially rewrote them, because millions of ordinary people quietly rewrote them with their viewing habits, listening habits, and attention. That's the real story. Not one politician, not one election, not one television appearance. The real story is that audiences now decide where influence lives. And anyone who wants to compete in modern politics has to understand that reality. You don't have to like it. You don't even have to agree with it. But ignoring it won't make it disappear. If the conversation proved anything, it's that the old playbook no longer guarantees success. Politics has entered a different era. The candidates who recognize that shift and who are willing to step into conversations wherever people are actually listening will be better positioned than those who cling to yesterday's assumptions. That's not a partisan observation. It's an observation about the changing relationship between media, politics, and the public. And whether you're a politician, a journalist, a comedian, or simply someone trying to make sense of the headlines, that's probably the most important takeaway from the entire evening.